In the sweltering heat of August 1843, Dr. William Prescott stood in the parlor of Magnolia Grove Plantation in Wilkes County, Georgia, holding the 31st infant, born to an enslaved woman named Delilah. The baby, like every child before it, possessed features that were unmistakably those of Cornelius Ashford, not the plantation owner, Edmund Ashford, but his younger brother. The same distinctive cleft chin, the same unusually pale gray eyes, the same birthmark behind the left ear, a small crescent-shaped discoloration that appeared on every single one of Delilah's children without exception. Dr. Prescott had delivered 23 of these 31 babies over the span of 17 years. He had witnessed the impossible repetition of genetic characteristics that defied everything he understood about human reproduction. He had watched Edmund Ashford's face transform from confusion to suspicion to something far darker each time a new child emerged bearing his brother's unmistakable likeness. And he had kept meticulous records of every birth, every measurement, every impossible similarity, because William Prescott understood that he was witnessing something that would haunt him until his dying day. The doctor held the newborn girl in his weathered hands, examining her features with the same methodical attention he had applied to her 30 siblings before her. The gray eyes that seemed to look through rather than at him. The slightly asymmetrical cleft in the chin that matched Cornelius Ashford's precisely. And there behind the left ear, already visible despite the infant's age, that distinctive crescent-shaped birthmark that had appeared on every single child Delilah had ever produced. Prescott had measured this birthmark on child after child, documenting its exact dimensions, its precise position, its unchanging characteristics. On this 31st infant, it was identical to all the others within a margin of error too small for his instruments to detect. What happened at Magnolia Grove Plantation between 1826 and 1843 remains one of the most disturbing documented cases of reproductive exploitation in the antebellum South. The story involves betrayal between brothers, systematic abuse of an enslaved woman, and a mystery that medical science of the era could not explain. The truth, when it finally emerged, would destroy the Ashford family completely and leave questions that historians still debate today. The Ashford family had owned land in Wilkes County since 1792, when Bartholomew Ashford received a land grant of 2,000 acres as payment for his service in the Revolutionary War. Bartholomew had been a lieutenant under General Nathaniel Greene during the Southern Campaign, distinguished by neither particular bravery nor tactical brilliance, but by the simple virtue of survival. He was one of the few men from his original unit to see the war's end with all his limbs attached. The Georgia land grant was his reward for endurance rather than heroism. But Bartholomew proved to be a far better farmer than the soldier. By the 1820s, the family had established themselves as one of the most prominent planting dynasties in central Georgia, with holdings that included Magnolia Grove, a 1,700-acre cotton operation, and Riverside, a smaller property of 800 acres that produced tobacco and rice. Bartholomew had expanded his original 2,000 acres through shrewd purchases during the financial panics of 1807 and 1819. When desperate planters sold their land for pennies on the dollar, he built the main house at Magnolia Grove in 1814, a Greek revival structure with 16 rooms and wide verandas, designed to capture whatever breezes might penetrate the Georgia heat. Bartholomew's sons Edmund and Cornelius were born 3 years apart. Edmund arrived in 1801, Cornelius in 1804. From their earliest years, the brothers could not have been more different, and Bartholomew made no secret of which son he preferred. Edmund was tall and broad-shouldered, with dark hair and brown eyes that matched their mother's Scots-Irish heritage. He was practical, methodical, and utterly devoted to the business of plantation management. By age 12, he could calculate crop yields in his head. By 16, he was managing work crews alongside the overseer. By 20, he had already implemented crop rotation systems that increased Magnolia Grove's yield by 40%. Cornelius, by contrast, was slight and fair with those distinctive pale gray eyes that seemed to look through people rather than at them. These eyes came from Bartholomew's mother, a woman who had died long before her grandchildren were born, but whose portrait hung in the main parlor, her gray gaze following visitors as they moved through their room. Cornelius showed no interest in agriculture or commerce. Instead, he spent his youth reading philosophy, writing poetry, and pursuing what his father dismissively called useless intellectual diversions. He could quote Virgil and Homer in the original Latin and Greek, but he could not tell the difference between a cotton boll ready for picking and one that needed another week on the plant. When Bartholomew died in 1824, his will reflected his assessment of his son's capabilities. Edmund received Magnolia Grove and the majority of the family's enslaved workers, 147 people whose names were listed in the will as property, alongside livestock and farming equipment. Cornelius received Riverside, a small cash settlement of $8,000, and instructions to make something of himself or face permanent disinheritance to a trust structure that would eventually transfer his property to Edmund's children. The brothers' relationship, already strained by their fathers, obvious favoritism, deteriorated further after the will was read. Cornelius believed he had been cheated of his birthright, that his father's preference for Edmund had blinded the old man to Cornelius's true worth. Edmund believed his brother was a lazy dreamer who deserved exactly what he had received, that their father had been, if anything, too generous in leaving Cornelius anything at all. For 2 years they barely spoke, communicating only through lawyers when property disputes arose over boundary lines and shared water rights. Then in the spring of 1826, everything changed. Cornelius arrived at Magnolia Grove unannounced on a Tuesday afternoon in March, riding up the long Oak Line Drive on a rented horse because he had been forced to sell his own. He claimed he wanted to reconcile with his brother Edmund. Recently married to a woman named Margaret Townsend from a prominent Savannah family, was initially suspicious. Margaret, who had heard nothing good about her brother-in-law from anyone in the county, urged Edmund to send Cornelius away. But Edmund, despite his practical nature, harbored guilt about the circumstances of their father's will. He had not asked to be favored. He had simply been himself, and Bartholomew had responded accordingly. Cornelius was charming when he chose to be, possessed of a wit and eloquence that Edmund entirely lacked. Over several weeks of visits, the brothers appeared to repair their fractured relationship. Cornelius praised Edmund's improvements to the plantation. Edmund offered Cornelius advice about managing Riverside. They rode together through the fields, dined together in the evenings, and gradually rebuilt something resembling the bond they had shared as young children before their father's favoritism had driven them apart. Cornelius began spending extended periods at Magnolia Grove, ostensibly helping Edmund with plantation management, while learning the skills their father had never bothered to teach him. It was during one of these visits that Cornelius first encountered Delilah. Delilah had arrived at Magnolia Grove in 1825, purchased at auction in Augusta for $750. She was approximately 18 years old at the time of purchase, though no exact birth records existed. The bill of sale preserved in the Ashford family papers describes her as a healthy female of mixed heritage, suitable for domestic service or field labor, with no history of running or discipline problems. The document was signed by her previous owner, a bankrupt merchant named Harkins, who was selling everything he owned to satisfy creditors. What the document failed to capture was her extraordinary beauty, a fact noted in multiple sources from this period. She stood approximately 5'7" in tall, unusual height for a woman of any race in that era. Her features suggested a complex ancestry that might have included African, European, and possibly Native American heritage, though such determinations were always speculative in the context of American slavery. What was certain was that she drew attention wherever she went, and that this attention would prove to be both her greatest protection and her greatest danger. Dr. Prescott, who examined her shortly after her arrival as part of Edmund's routine health assessments of new purchases, wrote in his private journal that Delilah possesses a remarkable physical presence with features that suggest significant European ancestry. Her skin is light enough to pass for Mediterranean. Her hair falls in loose waves rather than tight curls, and her eyes are an unusual shade of amber that I have rarely seen in persons of African descent. She carries herself with a dignity that suggests either previous house service or perhaps even some education, though she claims no knowledge of reading or writing. Her teeth are in excellent condition. Her limbs are straight and strong, and she shows no signs of previous illness or mistreatment. She will fetch a high price if Edmund ever chooses to sell her, though I suspect he will not. That final observation proved to be one of the most prescient in Prescott's long career. Edmund initially assigned Delilah to kitchen work under the supervision of an older enslaved woman named Hattie. Hattie had been at Magnolia Grove since before Edmund's birth, had known his mother and occupied a position of relative authority within the enslaved community. She was responsible for feeding everyone on the plantation, from the Ashford family in the main house to the field workers in the quarters, and her kitchen was her kingdom. She took one look at Delilah and saw trouble. "That girl is too pretty for her own good," Hattie reportedly told another enslaved woman named Rose, Master Edmund already looking at her like she made of gold. "Nothing good comes from white men looking at colored women that way. Nothing good ever come of it." Hattie's assessment proved accurate within months. Edmund found reasons to visit the kitchen with increasing frequency. He praised Delilah's cooking, though she was merely assisting and had prepared nothing herself. He requested that she serve meals in the dining room, a task usually reserved for house servants with more experience. He had new clothes made for her, finer than what other enslaved people wore, and instructed Hattie to ensure she was always clean and presentable. Margaret Ashford observed her husband's lingering glances at the new servant with growing alarm. She had been married to Edmund for less than a year and was already pregnant with their first child. The marriage had been arranged by their families for practical reasons, combining Ashford land with towns and shipping connections. But Margaret had hoped for affection, if not love. Now she watched her husband become obsessed with an enslaved woman who represented everything Margaret was not: exotic, mysterious, and utterly powerless to refuse any demand made of her. In the fall of 1825, Margaret demanded that Delilah be returned to the kitchen and kept out of the main house entirely. Edmund complied, but his interest had been noted by others on the plantation, including his brother. Cornelius, during his reconciliation visits, had also observed Delilah. Unlike Edmund, who was possessive but cautious, Cornelius approached the situation with the recklessness that characterized his entire life. He began seeking out opportunities to be alone with Delilah, appearing in the kitchen during quiet hours, engineering encounters in the outbuildings where she was sometimes sent to retrieve supplies. The exact circumstances of what happened between Cornelius and Delilah were never recorded directly. Enslaved women did not testify in courts. Their experiences were not considered worthy of documentation by the white people who controlled such records. But the outcome of those encounters became undeniable in March of 1826. When Delilah became pregnant for the first time, the child, a boy, was born in December of that year. Edmund recorded the birth in his plantation ledger with the notation "male child born to Delilah, healthy, named Samuel." The entry included no mention of paternity, which was standard practice for enslaved children. Under Georgia law, the children of enslaved women were property belonging to the mother's owner, regardless of who the biological father might be. This legal fiction allowed plantation owners to profit from their own sexual abuse of enslaved women while maintaining the pretense of respectable family life. What was not standard was the notation Edmund added in different ink, apparently months later. Peculiar coloring, and then beneath that in handwriting that had clearly been inscribed while Edmund was intoxicated or extremely agitated. Impossible. Samuel, like all 30 of his siblings who would follow, was born with pale gray eyes and the distinctive features of Cornelius Ashford. The resemblance was impossible to ignore. By the time Samuel was 6 months old, anyone who had ever met Cornelius could see the family likeness. The same bone structure with its angular cheekbones and slightly narrow chin. The same unusual eye color, that pale gray that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. The same crescent-shaped birthmark behind the left ear, a mark that Cornelius had carried since his own birth, and that his mother had always called his angel's kiss. Edmund's reaction to this discovery went unrecorded in any surviving document, but the circumstantial evidence suggests a profound psychological break. He sent a letter to Cornelius in April of 1827, formally ending their reconciliation. The letter, preserved in the Cornelius Ashford Papers at the University of Georgia, is brief and devastating in its implications. "Brother," it reads, "I know what you have done. I know what you are. Do not return to Magnolia Grove. If you do, I will kill you." There is no signature, only Edmund's wax seal pressed so forcefully into the paper that the wax cracked. Cornelius's response, sent a week later, was equally cryptic and far more cruel. Dear brother, I have done nothing that you did not drive me to do. You had everything, the land, the money, father's love, and still you wanted more. You wanted her too, though you pretended otherwise to your precious Margaret. The fault lies not in my actions, but in your insufferable pride. I will stay away from your precious plantation. But remember that blood will tell. It always does. Yours in eternal brotherhood, Cornelius. What neither brother explicitly stated in their correspondence was the truth that both understood. Cornelius had impregnated Delilah, either through seduction or force during his visits to Magnolia Grove. The child, Samuel, was his biological son, not Edmund's. And this betrayal, this fundamental violation of trust between brothers, would shape everything that followed for the next 17 years. But here is where the story takes its darkest and most inexplicable turn. Instead of selling Delilah, which would have been the expected response of a humiliated plantation owner seeking to remove the evidence of his shame, Edmund did something far more disturbing. He kept her. More than that, he began systematically impregnating her himself year after year for the next 17 years. Delilah would bear 31 children total between 1826 and 1843, and every single child she bore, regardless of the year or circumstances of conception, continued to look exactly like Cornelius. This biological impossibility was noted by Dr. Prescott in increasingly alarmed journal entries that spanned nearly 2 decades. The second child, born in 1828, possessed the same gray eyes and cleft chin as the first. Prescott examined the infant carefully, measuring the distance between eyes, the angle of the jaw, the precise position of the crescent birth arc. His measurements matched Samuel's exactly within margins so small they might have been the same person. So did the third child, born in 1829, and the fourth in 1830, and the fifth in 1831. By the time Delilah had borne 10 children, all displaying identical features that matched Cornelius rather than Edmund Doctor, Prescott had begun questioning his own sanity. He requested a leave from his practice to visit medical colleagues in Charleston, seeking any explanation for what he termed unprecedented hereditary persistence. I have examined the latest infant, he wrote in December of 1833, and I am forced to conclude that either everything I learned about human inheritance is wrong, or something deeply unnatural is occurring at Magnolia Grove. The statistical probability of 10 consecutive children displaying identical paternal characteristics when fathered by 2 different men is essentially zero. I have consulted mathematical texts to confirm this assessment. The odds are greater than 1 in several billion. Yet here they are, 10 children with Cornelius Ashford's face, born to a woman who has not seen Cornelius in 7 years. Prescott's Charleston colleagues were equally baffled. The prevailing medical theory of the era held that both parents contributed to a child's characteristics through mixing of humoral essences during conception. Some traits from the father, some from the mother, blended together to create a new individual. The idea that a mother could continue producing children who looked identical to a man who had not touched her in years was considered impossible by every physician Prescott consulted. Several theories were proposed, each more desperate than the last. Perhaps Cornelius had marked Delilah in some spiritual sense that transcended physical presence. Perhaps Edmund and Cornelius, despite their apparent differences, were actually twins who had been told they were born 3 years apart. Perhaps Delilah was somehow meeting Cornelius secretly, despite Edmund's increasingly paranoid security measures. None of these theories satisfied Prescott's scientific training, but he could offer no better explanation. The enslaved community at Magnolia Grove developed their own interpretation of this phenomenon, one that spread through whispered conversations in the quarters and around cooking fires after dark. They believed Delilah had been marked by Cornelius in some spiritual sense, that his essence had been imprinted on her womb in a way that transcended physical presence. Some called it a curse, punishment, visited upon Edmund for sins, real or imagined. Others called it justice, divine intervention to ensure that Edmund would never have children by Delilah that he could truly call his own. Old Hattie, who had known Delilah since her arrival, reportedly told younger workers that some men leave their souls behind when they plant their seed. And Mr. Cornelius left his whole self inside that girl. Every baby she makes going to wear his face until she dies. Edmund's response to this ongoing humiliation evolved through distinct phases over the years. In the early period, According to testimony given decades later during legal proceedings, he beat Delilah severely after each birth, demanding to know how she was managing to produce children that looked like his brother. These beatings occurred in the small cabin where Delilah was confined during her pregnancies, witnessed only by Hattie and occasionally other enslaved women who assisted with the births. Delilah, who endured these beatings in silence, reportedly told Edmund the same thing each time. "I cannot control what God puts in my belly, master. Only God decides what a child looks like. I do what you tell me. I stay where you put me. I do not see your brother. Not since before Samuel was born. I cannot explain. Only God can explain it." This answer, which was either genuinely naive or calculated with remarkable sophistication to maximize Edmund's psychological torment, seemed to drive him to ever greater extremes. He became convinced that Delilah was somehow communicating with Cornelius through supernatural means, that she was practicing African conjuring or witchcraft that allowed her to summon his brother's essence into her womb. He hired a minister to pray over her. He had her examined by a physician who specialized in female complaints, seeking any physical explanation for the phenomenon. He even consulted a woman known locally as a conjure woman, a free black woman who was rumored to have powers over the spiritual realm, though this consultation was conducted in secret and is only known through oblique references in Edmund's private correspondence. None of these measures made any difference. Children 11 through 20, born between 1835 and 1840, all emerged with Cornelius's features. Dr. Prescott, increasingly disturbed by what he was witnessing, began documenting each birth with obsessive detail. He measured the infants' skulls with calipers. He recorded the exact shade of their eye color using a system of his own devising. He sketched the birth arcs and compiled charts showing their identical placement and dimensions. His journals from this period fill 3 volumes and represent one of the most comprehensive medical documentations of birth characteristics ever compiled in antebellum America. By 1835, according to accounts from surviving formerly enslaved people recorded by the Federal Writers Project in the 1930s, Edmund had become obsessed with disproving the impossible. He isolated Delilah in a cabin far from the main slave quarters, posting guards to ensure no other man could access her. The guards were changed frequently to prevent any of them from developing sympathy for Delilah or being bribed by potential intruders. Edmund personally supervised her meals to prevent any possible administration of substances that might explain the phenomenon. He even had her examined by Dr. Prescott before and after each of his visits to her cabin, seeking evidence that anyone else had touched her. Meanwhile, Cornelius Ashford had fallen into complete dissipation at Riverside. Without the discipline that Edmund possessed naturally, Cornelius had allowed his smaller plantation to deteriorate into ruin. Crops failed year after year because he could not be bothered to supervise their planting properly. Enslaved workers ran away with increasing frequency, and Cornelius lacked both the resources and the motivation to recover them. His overseer quit in 1832 after going unpaid for 6 months. Debts accumulated at an alarming rate. By 1838, Riverside was mortgaged to the limit, and Cornelius was drinking heavily, spending most of his days in a stupor and most of his nights telling anyone who would listen about his brother's humiliation. The rumors spread throughout Wilkes County and beyond, carried by travelers and merchants who passed through the region. In drawing rooms and taverns across central Georgia, people whispered about Edmund Ashford's peculiar situation. Some versions of the story cast Edmund as a victim of his brother's deception. A man cuckolded not just once, but continuously for more than a decade. Others suggested that Edmund himself was impotent and had brought in Cornelius deliberately to produce children he could not father himself, only to be betrayed by his brother's refusal to produce children that looked like Edmund. Still others hinted at darker possibilities: witchcraft, African conjuring, or deals made with forces that decent Christian people did not discuss openly. Margaret Ashford, Edmund's wife, was perhaps the most tragic figure in this entire situation, apart from Delilah herself. She had borne Edmund 2 legitimate children in the main house, a son named Edmund Jr. in 1827 and a daughter named Elizabeth in 1830. Both children were healthy and clearly resembled their parents in the normal expected way. But Margaret had watched her husband father at least 20 additional children with an enslaved woman during their marriage by 1840. Children who represented not just infidelity, but an ongoing psychological wound that never healed. According to letters Margaret wrote to her sister in Savannah, letters that somehow survived and eventually made their way into the historical record through the sisters' descendants. She begged Edmund repeatedly to sell Delilah and end the nightmare that had consumed their lives. "I cannot endure another year of watching those children grow," she wrote in 1836. "They are everywhere on this plantation, nearly 20 of them now, each one bearing the face of a man I have never met, but whose features are burned into my memory from the portrait in the parlor. I see them in the fields. I see them carrying water and splitting wood. I see them in the kitchen helping old Hattie. And every time I see them, I see my husband's shame and my own failure to hold his attention. My husband is destroying himself with this obsession, and he is destroying me along with him. Please, sister, speak to father about intervening. I fear for my sanity if this continues." Margaret's father, a wealthy Savannah merchant named Thomas Townsend, did intervene in the spring of 1837, traveling to Magnolia Grove to confront Edmund directly. The meeting, reconstructed from multiple sources, including Townsend's own diary, did not go well. Edmund reportedly flew into a rage when his father-in-law suggested selling Delilah, shouting that no one understood what he was trying to accomplish. What exactly Edmund believed he was accomplishing remains unclear from the historical record. Some historians have suggested that Edmund was attempting to prove through repeated breeding that he could eventually produce a child that looked like himself, overcoming through sheer persistence whatever force was causing Delilah's children to resemble Cornelius. Others have proposed that Edmund's obsession had become self-perpetuating, that he could no longer stop, even if he wanted to, because doing so would be admitting defeat to his brother. Still others have suggested darker motivations related to the psychological dynamics of abuse and control that characterize so much of the institution of slavery. Whatever Edmund's reasoning, his refusal to end the situation drove Margaret to increasing desperation. By 1840, she was spending more time at her family's home in Savannah than at Magnolia Grove, returning only for brief visits to maintain appearances. Her legitimate children were educated by tutors in Savannah rather than at the plantation. Her marriage, whatever genuine affection might once have existed within it, had become a hollow shell, maintained only by the legal and financial complications that would accompany formal separation. By 1840, Delilah had borne 25 children, all surviving infancy, which was itself remarkable given the high infant mortality rates of the period. Even among wealthy white families, losing one or more children before age 5 was common among enslaved people who received minimal medical care and often insufficient nutrition. Childhood mortality rates exceeded 30% in some regions. Yet all 25 of Delilah's children had survived, as if whatever force was ensuring they bore Cornelius's features was also ensuring they remained alive to display them. These children ranged in age from 14 down to newborn, and all of them bore Cornelius Ashford's distinctive features. Edmund had long since stopped trying to pass them off as his own children or explain them to visitors. Instead, he assigned them to various labor positions around the plantation, treating them with neither special favor nor particular cruelty, simply incorporating them into the workforce, as he would any other enslaved people. But everyone on the plantation knew who they were. They were the marked children, the ghost children, the living evidence of something that could not be explained. The psychological toll on Edmund was evident to everyone who encountered him during this period. Dr. Prescott noted in 1841 that Edmund has aged 20 years in the past decade. His hair is entirely gray at 40 years of age, and his face bears lines that would be a man of 60. His hands shake constantly, whether from excessive drink or nervous disorder, I cannot determine. And he speaks often of demons and curses and the sins of his brother, sometimes in conversations where such subjects have no relevance. I fear for his mental stability and have suggested he seek treatment at the asylum in Milledgeville, but he refuses to leave the plantation for any length of time. Prescott's concerns about Edmund's mental state proved well-founded as the 1840s progressed. Edmund became increasingly paranoid, seeing conspiracies everywhere. He accused his overseer of colluding with Cornelius and dismissed the man without notice. He accused his house servants of spying and had several of them whipped for offenses they had not committed. He began carrying a pistol everywhere he went, even to meals in his own dining room. Convinced that assassins sent by his brother might appear at any moment, the situation reached its breaking point in the summer of 1843, shortly after the birth of Delilah's 31st child. This final infant, a girl, emerged with the same gray eyes, the same cleft chin, and the same crescent birth arc as all her siblings. Dr. Prescott, holding the baby while Delilah recovered from the delivery, reportedly said aloud what he had been thinking for years. "This is not possible. None of this is medically possible. I have delivered hundreds of infants in my career, and I have never seen anything like this. It violates everything we know about human reproduction." What happened next was pieced together from multiple witness accounts. During the subsequent investigation, Edmund, who had been drinking heavily since the onset of Delilah's labor, entered the cabin where she had given birth. His clothes were disheveled. His eyes were bloodshot. The pistol he now carried constantly was visible in his waistband. He stood for a long moment looking at the infant and Dr. Prescott's arms, his face cycling through emotions too complex and too rapid to read. Then he turned to Delilah, who lay exhausted on her bed after nearly 18 hours of labor, and asked her a question that witnesses would struggle to interpret for years afterward. "Where is he hiding?" Delilah's response went unrecorded, but whatever she said seemed to trigger something in Edmund. He produced the pistol from his waistband, pointed it at Delilah, and announced that he was going to end the curse once and for all. Dr. Prescott intervened immediately, placing himself between Edmund and the bed, the newborn still cradled in his arms. He warned his old friend that murder would bring consequences. Even Edmund's wealth and position could not escape, that killing an enslaved woman in front of witnesses would force even the most sympathetic sheriff to take action. Edmund hesitated, the pistol trembling in his hand, his face a mask of conflicting impulses. Then he lowered the weapon, but his words as he left the cabin were chilling. "If I cannot end it this way," he reportedly said, "I will find another way. My brother's spawn will not inherit what is rightfully mine. I will see them all in hell before I let that happen." 3 days later, Edmund Ashford rode to Riverside Plantation, where his brother Cornelius still lived in increasingly squalid conditions. The once elegant house had fallen into disrepair. The fields had gone. Most of the enslaved workers had been sold to pay debts, leaving only a handful to maintain what could not be maintained. Cornelius himself had become a shell of the charming young man he had once been, bloated by drink, aged by dissolution, surrounded by empty bottles and unpaid bills. What exactly transpired between the brothers during this confrontation was never established with certainty, as no witnesses were present. What is known is that when Edmund returned to Magnolia Grove the following morning, Cornelius Ashford was dead. The official story which Edmund told to anyone who would listen and repeated in his formal statement to the sheriff was that Cornelius had attacked him with a knife during a dispute over old debts, and Edmund had shot his brother in self-defense. The single gunshot wound to Cornelius's chest was consistent with this account, as was the knife found near the body with Cornelius's fingerprints on the handle. The Wilkes County Sheriff, a man named Patterson, who owed significant gambling debts to Edmund, conducted only a cursory investigation before ruling the death justified homicide. The entire inquiry took less than 4 hours, but the enslaved community at both Magnolia Grove and Riverside knew better. Stories circulated that Edmund had murdered his brother in cold blood, that he had been planning the killing for years, that he believed Cornelius's death would somehow end the curse that had plagued him for 17 years. These stories were dismissed by white authorities as slave superstition and troublemaking, the natural tendency of enslaved people to see malice where none existed. But the stories persisted because they had the ring of truth. The question of whether Cornelius's death would affect future pregnancies became moot almost immediately. Delilah, whether through deliberate intervention, accumulated physical toll, or simply coincidence, never conceived again after her 31st child. Dr. Prescott speculated in his journal that her reproductive system had simply been exhausted after 17 years of continuous childbearing, a not unreasonable medical conclusion given the physical demands of producing 31 children, with minimal recovery time between pregnancies. But others whispered that the curse had been broken with Cornelius's death, that whatever spiritual connection had existed between him and Delilah had been severed when he died, and that no more children would come because the source of those children had been destroyed. What came next transformed this already disturbing story into something far worse, a descent into madness and cruelty that would shock even people accustomed to the casual brutality of slavery. With Cornelius dead and Delilah no longer producing children, Edmund turned his attention to a new obsession. He became convinced that among Delilah's 31 children, one must be hiding documentation that Cornelius had formally acknowledged paternity. This documentation, Edmund believed, could potentially give Cornelius's children legal claims to the Ashford estate. Though no such legal mechanism actually existed for enslaved children under Georgia law, Edmund's fear, irrational though it was, reflected a deeper anxiety about the stability of the entire slave system. The premise of American slavery rested on the legal fiction that enslaved people were property, not persons. But Delilah's children were obviously Edmund's blood relatives through their father, Cornelius. They were his nieces and nephews. If their paternity were formally acknowledged, it would create complications that the legal system was not designed to address. Could property inherit from its owner's relatives? Could enslaved children be considered legitimate heirs if their father had acknowledged them? The questions were absurd in practical terms, but Edmund's deteriorating mental state had abandoned practicality years earlier. Edmund began interrogating Delilah's children one by one. Starting with the oldest and working his way down, he brought them to a small building he had converted into what he called the questioning room, a former storage shed that he had equipped with devices designed to cause pain without permanent damage. What happened in that room was described decades later by survivors in testimonies that are difficult to read without feeling physically ill. Edmund employed methods of torture that he had apparently researched extensively, believing that pain would eventually extract the confession he sought. The first child to undergo this treatment was Samuel, the oldest, now 17 years old. Samuel, according to testimony from other enslaved people who heard his screams, endured 4 days of questioning before Edmund was satisfied that he knew nothing about any documents. He emerged unable to walk properly with injuries to his hands and feet that would never fully heal. The specific nature of these injuries suggests deliberate targeting of extremities to maximize pain while preserving the victim's economic value as a laborer. Edmund moved on to the next child, a 16-year-old named Thomas, who had been working in the cotton fields since age 10. Thomas lasted 3 days before Edmund concluded he had no information. Then came Rebecca, 15, whose questioning lasted 2 days. Over the following months, Edmund systematically tortured 12 of Delilah's children, ranging in age from 17 down to 10. Some sessions lasted days. Others ended quickly when the child lost consciousness and could not be revived for further questioning. 2 children died from their injuries, their deaths recorded in Edmund's ledger as accidents during discipline, a euphemism that would protect him from legal consequences under Georgia law that technically prohibited the murder of enslaved people, but rarely punished masters who killed their property. The surviving children displayed varying degrees of physical and psychological damage. Some recovered enough to continue working in the fields or house, though none would ever be the same. Others were permanently disabled, their value as laborers destroyed by the very man who owned them. All were traumatized in ways that would affect them for the rest of their lives, carrying the memories of their torture alongside the physical scars. And throughout this entire period, Delilah was forced to witness what was being done to her children. Knowing that any attempt to intervene would result in her own death and possibly worse treatment for them, she was brought to the questioning room during some sessions, forced to watch as Edmund demanded information from children who had no information to give. The psychological cruelty of this arrangement was clearly deliberate. Another form of torture directed at Delilah herself. Dr. Prescott, increasingly horrified by what he was witnessing, attempted to document Edmund's crimes while maintaining enough of their professional relationship to continue accessing the plantation. His private journals from this period contained detailed descriptions of injuries that matched known torture techniques, along with observations about Edmund's deteriorating mental state. He noted that Edmund spoke constantly about voices, about seeing Cornelius's face everywhere he looked, about needing to complete his work before his brother's children rose up against him. In one particularly disturbing entry, Prescott recorded a conversation in which Edmund explained his reasoning for the torture. "The children know something," Edmund reportedly said. "They must know something. Why else would they all look like him? Why else would God have marked them this way? They are hiding the truth from me, and I will find it if I have to break every bone in their bodies, Cornelius told them, something before he died. Prescott tried to reason with his old friend, pointing out that the children had been under Edmund's control their entire lives and had never had opportunity to meet Cornelius, much less receive documents from him. But Edmund was beyond reason. He had constructed an elaborate conspiracy theory in which everyone on the plantation was secretly working against him, in which Cornelius had somehow communicated with his children through supernatural means, in which the documented impossibility of their identical features was itself evidence of a plot too sophisticated for Edmund to fully comprehend. In February of 1844, Margaret Ashford finally took decisive action, unable to endure any more of her husband's madness. She fled Magnolia Grove with her two legitimate children, taking refuge with her father in Savannah. She would never return to the plantation, and she would spend the rest of her life trying to secure a legal separation from Edmund, an effort that was ultimately unsuccessful under Georgia law, which did not permit divorce, except in the most extreme circumstances, and did not consider a husband's treatment of enslaved people to be grounds for separation. Margaret's departure seemed to push Edmund even further into madness. Without his wife's moderating influence, such as it was, he became increasingly erratic. He fired his new overseer without cause. He stopped maintaining plantation records, leaving the ledgers blank for weeks at a time. He began selling off enslaved workers seemingly at random, then buying new ones who confused and terrified the remaining population. Crop yields plummeted because no one was supervising the work. Debts accumulated because bills went unpaid. By the summer of 1844, Magnolia Grove was on the verge of financial collapse. The end, when it came, was both predictable and shocking in its finality. On the night of September 12, 1844, a fire broke out in the main house at Magnolia Grove. The blaze was first noticed around 2 o'clock in the morning by an enslaved man named Joseph, who was making his way to the privy and saw flames flickering behind the parlor windows. By the time anyone could organize a response, the entire first floor was engulfed. By dawn, the elegant Greek revival structure that Bartholomew Ashford had built 30 years earlier was nothing but smoking ruins. Edmund Ashford's body was found in the rubble the next morning, burned beyond recognition, but identified by his distinctive pocket watch, which had survived the flames in a pocket of his coat. The official cause of death was listed as accidental fire, perhaps caused by a fallen candle or ember from the fireplace. Edmund had been drinking heavily that night, as he had been drinking heavily every night for years. It was easy to imagine him passing out with a candle still burning. Easy to imagine a spark landing on fabric and spreading before anyone could respond. But almost no one who knew the situation believed it was an accident. Some suspected that Delilah or her surviving children had set the fire, finally taking revenge for years of abuse after Edmund's torture campaign had pushed them beyond endurance. Others believed that Edmund had set the fire himself, either deliberately committing suicide or accidentally while in a drunken stupor so profound he did not notice his house burning around him. Still others whispered about Cornelius's ghost, claiming that the dead brother had finally taken his revenge from beyond the grave, that the curse had not ended with Cornelius's death, but had simply transformed into something more directly destructive. The investigation into Edmund's death was conducted by the same Sheriff Patterson who had ruled Cornelius's death justified homicide. He spent exactly 1 day at Magnolia Grove before concluding that the fire was accidental and closing the case. No enslaved people were questioned about their whereabouts that night. No evidence was collected from the ruins. The Ashford family's remaining white relatives, eager to avoid further scandal and even more eager to claim whatever assets remained, quickly accepted the ruling and moved to settle the estate. What happened to Delilah and her surviving children in the immediate aftermath of Edmund's death reflects the casual cruelty that characterized the entire institution of slavery. The estate, burdened by significant debts that had accumulated during Edmund's final years of neglect, was liquidated at auction in November of 1844. The enslaved population, including Delilah and 26 of her surviving children, were sold individually or in small groups to buyers from across the South. Delilah herself, now approximately 37 years old, and physically depleted from 17 years of childbearing and abuse, sold for only $220, a fraction of her original purchase price. Her beauty had faded. Her body showed the wear of 31 pregnancies. Her value as a laborer was limited. The buyer was a small farmer from Alabama named Jennings, who needed household help for his elderly mother and was willing to pay a low price for a woman who came with a reputation for causing trouble. But before she left Georgia, something remarkable happened that would ensure at least part of her story survived. Dr. Prescott, who had witnessed this entire saga from beginning to end, approached the executive of Edmund's estate with a proposal. He offered to purchase 3 of Delilah's younger children, the ones too small to bring high prices at auction, ostensibly to train them as medical assistants in his practice. His offer was accepted without question. What the executive did not know was that Dr. Prescott had no intention of keeping these children enslaved. He transported them to Philadelphia, where he had connections in the abolitionist movement, and arranged for their formal manumission under Pennsylvania law. These 3 children, aged 8, 6, and 4 at the time of their liberation, grew up free in the North. 2 of them would eventually learn to read and write, and one of them, the youngest girl, would leave behind a memoir that provides crucial first-hand information about life at Magnolia Grove. This memoir, titled Memories of Magnolia, and written in 1882, is the source of many details in this account. Its author, who went by the name Grace Freeman after her liberation, described the experience of being one of 31 children who all looked alike. "We were called the ghost children by the other slaves," she wrote, "because we all had the same face, the face of a man none of us had ever met. Master Edmund would stare at us sometimes with such hatred in his eyes that I thought he might strike us dead where we stood. But we had done nothing wrong. We were only children. We did not ask to be born with gray eyes and a mark behind our ears. We did not ask for any of it." Grace's memoir also describes Delilah with a daughter's loving detail, providing one of the few surviving accounts of Delilah's personality and character. "My mother was the strongest person I ever knew," she wrote. "She bore 31 children and watched at least 2 of them die from Master Edmund's cruelty. She endured things that I cannot write down even now, 40 years later, because some memories are too terrible for words. But she never broke. She never stopped protecting us as best she could, even though her protection was limited by the chains that bound her, and she never stopped loving us, even though our faces reminded her every day of the man who had violated her." Grace's memoir circulated among abolitionist communities in the North before the Civil War and was reprinted in anti-slavery newspapers as evidence of slavery's horrors. After the war, it was largely forgotten until historians rediscovered it in the 20th century and recognized its significance as a primary source document. The fate of Delilah's scattered children reflects the broader tragedy of slavery's destruction of family bonds. Of the 26 children sold at the estate auction, only 11 have been traced through historical records. Some ended up on cotton plantations in Alabama and Mississippi, working the same brutal labor that had characterized their lives at Magnolia Grove. Others were sold further south to Louisiana sugar operations, where conditions were even harsher. At least 3 were sold to slave traders who transported them to the newly opened territories of Texas. Their descendants, if any, survive today, likely have no knowledge of their connection to each other or to the bizarre circumstances of their birth. The 11 children whose fates can be documented all shared one remarkable characteristic that continued to baffle observers for generations. According to records from the Civil War era and beyond, every single one of them who survived to adulthood had children of their own who displayed the same distinctive features: the gray eyes, the cleft chin, the crescent birthmark behind the left ear. Whatever genetic quirk had marked Delilah's children seemed to persist into the next generation and beyond. Defying the normal patterns of inheritance that would have predicted these characteristics would dilute and disappear over time. Grace Freeman noted this phenomenon in her memoir's final chapter. "I have met 4 of my siblings since the war ended," she wrote. "We found each other through the Freedmen's Bureau and through advertisements placed in newspapers across the South searching for lost family members. Each of them had children, and each of those children bore our father's face, though none of us ever knew him while he lived. I have come to believe that Cornelius Ashford marked us in some way that science cannot explain, that his features were stamped upon our blood and will continue through generations yet unborn. Whether this is curse or blessing, I cannot say. We Are Who We Are, the 31 children who all looked the same. Dr. William Prescott died in 1868 at the age of 72. His journals, donated to the Georgia Historical Society by his daughter, provide the most comprehensive medical documentation of the Magnolia Grove situation. In his final entry concerning the case, written shortly before his death, he reflected on what he had witnessed. "I have practiced medicine for nearly 50 years," he wrote, "and I have seen things that would challenge the faith of the most devout believer. But nothing in my experience compares to the mystery of Delilah's children. I examined every one of them with my own hands. I measured their features with calipers. I documented their identical birthmarks with drawings made at the moment of birth, and I cannot explain any of it. Perhaps God was sending a message to Edmund Ashford, marking every child with his brother's face as punishment for some sin I never understood. Perhaps there are natural mechanisms at work that our science has not yet discovered. Or perhaps some things are simply beyond human comprehension. Mysteries that will never be solved no matter how much we learn. The ruins of Magnolia Grove Plantation can still be found today, though little remains except foundation stones and the overgrown traces of what were once formal gardens. The land passed through many hands after the Ashford estate was liquidated, eventually being subdivided into small farms and timber lots. No historical marker commemorates what happened there. No museum displays Dr. Prescott's meticulous drawings of 31 children with identical faces. The story has been largely forgotten outside of academic circles that study the history of slavery, but perhaps that forgetting is itself significant. The horrors that occurred at Magnolia Grove were not unique. They were simply a particularly well-documented example of the systematic abuse that characterized American slavery. Countless other enslaved women were forced to bear children they did not want by men who viewed them as property rather than human beings. Countless other families were torn apart at auction. Countless other children grew up with complicated, painful questions about their origins that could never be answered. Delilah survived slavery, though just barely. She died in Alabama in 1864, just months before the end of the Civil War would have brought her freedom regardless. She was approximately 57 years old and had spent the last 20 years of her life in relative peace, serving an elderly woman who treated her with unusual kindness by the standards of the era. Her grave, according to Grace Freeman's memoir, was marked with a simple wooden cross that has long since rotted away. No photograph of her exists. No portrait was ever painted. The only visual record of her appearance comes from Dr. Prescott's clinical descriptions in his medical journals. But her legacy lives on in ways she could never have imagined. Genetic research conducted in the 21st century has identified several family groups across the American South and Midwest who carry the distinctive combination of traits that mark Delilah's children. The gray eyes, the cleft chin, the crescent birthmark behind the left ear. DNA analysis has confirmed that these families share common ancestry tracing back to Wilkes County, Georgia, in the mid-9th century. They are the descendants of the 31 children scattered by slavery, but connected by blood across generations. Some of these descendants have begun connecting with each other through genealogical websites and DNA testing services. They share photographs showing the persistent family resemblance that so tormented Edmund Ashford nearly 2 centuries ago. They exchange family stories passed down through generations, fragments of memory that hint at their unusual origin, and they grapple with the complicated emotions that come with learning that their existence began with an act of violation. The story of the slave woman who bore 31 children for her master, all 31. The exact image of his brother raises questions that extend far beyond one plantation in Georgia. It asks us to consider the meaning of identity when that identity is forced upon you by others. It asks us to reckon with the ways that trauma echoes through generations, visible not just in psychological patterns, but sometimes in physical features themselves. And it asks us to remember that behind every statistic about slavery, behind every dry entry in a plantation ledger, were human beings whose suffering was as real and as profound as anything we might experience today. Delilah never told her own story. She was illiterate, and even if she could write, the circumstances of her life gave her neither opportunity nor safety to record her experiences. What we know of her comes from the observations of others, from Dr. Prescott's medical notes, from Grace Freeman's memoir, from scattered references in court documents and estate records. Her voice has been lost to history, one of millions of voices silenced by a system designed to treat human beings as property. But her children survived. Her grandchildren survived. Her great-grandchildren and their descendants continue to survive, carrying forward a genetic legacy that began with betrayal between brothers and an enslaved woman who had no power to resist. They are living proof that even the most systematic attempts to destroy human beings can ultimately fail. That life persists and adapts and continues despite everything done to extinguish it. Modern genetic science, had it been available in Edmund Ashford's time, might have provided explanations that would have saved everyone involved considerable suffering. We now understand that certain genetic traits can be remarkably persistent, especially when they are carried on multiple chromosomes or are associated with dominant inheritance patterns. The combination of gray eyes, cleft chin, and crescent birthmark might represent what geneticists call a haploid, a group of genes inherited together as a single unit. If Cornelius carried a particularly strong haplotype that dominated over Edmund's genetic contributions, it could theoretically produce the results that Dr. Prescott documented. But even this explanation has problems. Modern geneticists who have examined Prescott's records note that the level of consistency he documented would be unusual even with a dominant haplotype. The identical positioning of the birthmark, measured to the millimeter on each child, suggests something beyond simple genetic inheritance. Some researchers have proposed that epigenetic factors might be involved, chemical modifications to DNA that can be influenced by environmental conditions and can persist across generations. Others have suggested that the records themselves might be unreliable. Persist across generations. Others have suggested that the records themselves might be unreliable, that Prescott's expectations colored his measurements and observations. We will never know for certain what caused Delilah's children to look identical. The physical evidence, the bodies themselves, were scattered across the South and are now beyond recovery. The genetic material that might have answered these questions has been diluted across nearly 2 centuries and millions of descendants. What remains are the documents, the testimonies, the questions that refuse to be answered. Perhaps that uncertainty is appropriate. The story of Magnolia Grove is ultimately not about genetics or science. It is about power and its abuse, about the ways that human beings can dehumanize each other when systems exist to enable that dehumanization. Edmund Ashford was not a monster born evil. He was a man shaped by a system that told him he could own other human beings, that their bodies and their children belonged to him, that his feelings of humiliation and betrayal justified any cruelty he chose to inflict. The same could be said of Cornelius, whose initial violation of Delilah set everything in motion. He was not acting out of some unique depravity, but out of the entitlement that slave society cultivated in white men from birth. He saw a beautiful woman who could not refuse him, and he took what he wanted without consideration of consequences. That his actions had consequences he could never have predicted does not absolve him of responsibility. And what of Delilah herself? What thoughts passed through her mind during those 17 years of bearing children she had not chosen? Of watching those children grow up marked by their father's face, of seeing some of them tortured and killed by a man who blamed them for circumstances beyond anyone's control. We can only imagine the depths of her suffering and the reserves of strength that allowed her to endure it. She left no record of her feelings, no account of her experiences. She exists in history only through the observations of others, a shadow defined by the spaces around her. The 31 children too deserve more consideration than they have received. They were innocent of everything except their own existence. They did not choose to be born. They did not choose their faces or their features. They did not choose to become walking reminders of their uncle's betrayal and their putative father's humiliation. Yet they bore the consequences of these circumstances throughout their lives. From Edmund's hatred to the torture campaign to their eventual scattering at auction, some of them, like Grace Freeman, found ways to create meaningful lives despite everything that had been done to them. Others were not so fortunate. The 2 children who died under Edmund's torture were named Daniel and Ruth. According to Dr. Prescott's records, Daniel was 11 years old when he died. Ruth was 12. Their graves, if they were buried at all, are unmarked and forgotten. They are among the millions of enslaved children whose lives were cut short by the institution that claimed to be essential to American prosperity. If you have been affected by this story, if it has made you think differently about the history that shaped our nation, please consider supporting organizations that work to preserve the memories and records of enslaved people. Their stories deserve to be remembered. even the ones that are difficult to hear, perhaps especially those. What do you think about this story? Do you believe there is a scientific explanation for what happened at Magnolia Grove? Or do you think something more mysterious was at work? Have you discovered surprising connections in your own family history? Leave your thoughts in the comments below. If you found this video compelling and want more dark historical mysteries like this, subscribe to Whispers in Frames. Hit the Combinations Frames notification bell so you never miss a story. And share this video with someone who appreciates the complex, often troubling histories that made our world what it is today. These stories need to be told. These voices need to be heard. Thank you for watching, and we will see you in the next